The stench hit first, an overpowering putrid wave that curled into the protagonist's nostrils before they even stepped outside. It was the kind of smell that made the eyes water, thick with rot and decay. At first, they thought a wild animal had died near the fence, maybe a raccoon or an unlucky possum. But as they stepped onto their back porch, their stomach twisted. The entire yard was a disaster zone. Dark, murky sludge oozed across the once thriving garden, drowning the tomato plants in a putrid tide. The raised flower beds were now islands in a sea of filth, their blossoms wilting from the toxic assault. The protagonist's workshop, a modest beloved space where they built furniture and tinkered with weekend projects, stood half submerged in the vile muck. Tools, wooden planks, and unfinished pieces floated in the sewage, the waterlogged remains of years of labor. Panic surged as they waded through the mess, the soles of their boots sinking into the foul sludge. Every step released new, nauseating bubbles, hinting at the sheer depth of the disaster. Something was terribly wrong. Sewage backups weren't uncommon in older neighborhoods, but this? This wasn't just a clog. This was a full-blown flood of human waste, an apocalyptic invasion of their property. And worse, there was no apparent source, no broken pipes on their property, no warning signs leading up to this catastrophe. Heart-pounding, the protagonist immediately called the homeowners association, fully expecting a swift response. After all, they paid their fees, followed the rules, mostly, and maintained their property better than most in the neighborhood. But their faith in the HOA was short-lived. The call was answered by Karen Thompson, the HOA president, whose voice oozed with forced politeness and an undertone of condescension. "Oh dear," she said, drawing out the syllables as if savoring their misfortune. "That sounds awful, but we haven't had any reports of plumbing issues in the area. Are you sure this isn't a personal maintenance issue?" The protagonist clenched their jaw. "Personal maintenance issue," they repeated, their voice incredulous. "Karen, my yard is literally full of raw sewage. It's coming from somewhere, and I sure as hell didn't install a pipeline of human waste through my property." Karen sighed dramatically, as if they were inconveniencing her by expecting basic responsibility. "I'll have someone look into it, but these things take time. You know how backed up the city inspectors are." Then, in a voice thick with false sympathy, she added, "In the meantime, I'd advise you to avoid making a scene. These sorts of problems can affect property values." The call ended with a hollow promise of, "We'll be in touch," leaving the protagonist gripping their phone in frustration. HOA negligence wasn't new, but this wasn't just a case of ignoring a broken fence or delaying landscaping. This was an environmental disaster, and Karen Thompson was treating it like an overdue lawn-mowing complaint, refusing to let their home turn into a cesspool while waiting for the HOA's non-existent assistance. The protagonist decided to investigate. They spent hours combing through city records, plumbing maps, and old neighborhood schematics, trying to pinpoint the source of the sewage. Their own plumbing was fine, confirmed by their own checks and a desperate call to a local plumber, Stanley, who was as baffled as they were. But something didn't add up. The backups were too severe, too sudden. And then, after tracing the direction of the flow, they made a shocking discovery. The source wasn't natural at all, it was deliberate. A pipe, hastily installed and poorly hidden behind a row of HOA-planted bushes, connected to the neighborhood's main sewage line. And that pipe, it diverted waste directly onto their property. The protagonist stared at the evidence, a cold fury settling over them. This wasn't an accident. Someone had gone out of their way to reroute a sewage line straight into their yard. There was only one entity in the neighborhood with both the authority and sheer audacity to do something like this: the HOA. The realization sent a surge of adrenaline through their veins. This wasn't just negligence. This was sabotage. Determined to prove their theory, the protagonist called Stanley back. The old-school plumber, gruff but thorough, arrived within the hour, his toolbox clanking with the weight of experience. Together, they examined the illicit pipeline, tracing it back to an unauthorized modification in the neighborhood's main sewage network. "Jesus Christ," Stanley muttered, running a gloved hand over the shoddy pipework. "This ain't just bad plumbing. This is a hack job. Whoever did this wasn't just cutting corners. They were saving a hell of a lot of money by dumping waste where they shouldn't." He took out his phone and snapped pictures, documenting every misaligned joint, every illegal connection, every clear sign that the HOA had intentionally diverted sewage away from their own infrastructure. But it got worse. Stanley ran a test on the water composition and frowned at the results. "This isn't just sewage," he said, shaking his head. "There's chemical runoff in here, paint thinner, solvents, industrial waste. This isn't just a plumbing problem, it's an environmental hazard." The protagonist's stomach twisted. Not only had the HOA been dumping human waste onto their property, but they had also been illegally disposing of hazardous materials, likely to cut costs on proper waste disposal. They weren't just facing a property dispute anymore, they were standing on the edge of an environmental scandal. Armed with undeniable proof, the protagonist began digging deeper into the HOA's dealings, and what they found was worse than they had ever imagined. Through a combination of public records, leaked emails, and whispered conversations with disgruntled neighbors, they uncovered a dark truth. The HOA had been planning their removal for months. Emails between Karen Thompson and other board members outlined a scheme to devalue the protagonist's property, push them into foreclosure, and acquire the land for a lucrative redevelopment project. The sewage disaster wasn't just negligence or incompetence, it was deliberate. The HOA had seen an opportunity to force them out and taken it without hesitation. Worse still, these emails hinted at deeper corruption, embezzled funds, kickbacks from shady contractors, and a long history of manipulating property values for financial gain. It was a web of deceit, and Karen Thompson sat at the center of it, pulling the strings with cold, calculated efficiency. The protagonist felt a surge of righteous fury. They had been targeted, their home turned into a toxic wasteland for the sake of greed. But they weren't just going to sit back and let it happen. No, they were going to fight back. And they weren't going to fight fair. Fueled by their discovery, the protagonist reached out to their neighbors, unsure of what kind of response they would get. Would they care? Would they side with the HOA? Or would they be too afraid to get involved? What they didn't expect was an outpouring of shared frustration. One by one, people came forward, each with their own horror story. An elderly couple, the Johnsons, had been fined relentlessly for unauthorized garden gnomes. A single mother named Lisa had received threats over her child's sidewalk chalk drawings. A veteran named Miguel had been charged for excessive noise when his wheelchair ramp was installed. Story after story painted a picture of an HOA that wasn't just corrupt, it was abusive, preying on homeowners with bogus fines and arbitrary rules designed to bleed them dry. But the sewage scandal was the final straw. People were furious. No one had imagined the HOA would go as far as rerouting human waste onto someone's property. If they could do that, what else were they capable of? The protagonist, once isolated in their battle, suddenly found themselves leading a movement. Late-night meetings turned into an organized resistance. People started gathering their own evidence, digging through their paperwork, and compiling complaints. The HOA had been powerful because they operated in the shadows, picking off homeowners one by one. But now they were facing an army. The first sign that Karen Thompson had noticed their resistance came in the form of a letter. Bold, red ink screamed notice of violation across the top, followed by a list of absurd infractions. The protagonist was being fined thousands of dollars for creating a public nuisance, damage to neighborhood property, and even failure to maintain landscaping, all because of the sewage the HOA itself had dumped onto their land. It was a blatant act of retaliation, a desperate attempt to financially cripple them before their evidence could gain traction. The protagonist laughed bitterly. Karen must have thought they would panic, that they would cave under the pressure like so many before them. But she had underestimated them. Instead of paying, they forwarded the letter to their lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Cynthia who specialized in fighting corrupt HOAs. Cynthia had already been looking into the HOA's bylaws, and now she had all the ammunition she needed. "Let them try," she said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of battle. "This is harassment, plain and simple. We'll take them apart." The protagonist's resolve hardened. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one, but as much as Cynthia fought, the legal system moved at a snail's pace. Complaints were filed, violations documented, but government agencies took their time investigating. The city inspector was backlogged. The environmental agency was reviewing the case. The police. They said it was a civil matter, unless clear evidence of criminal intent surfaced. Karen had played the game well, paper trails were missing, officials were dragging their feet, and the HOA's lawyers were skilled at stalling. Weeks passed, and the sewage remained. The protagonist's property was still a disaster zone, the smell seeping into everything. Meanwhile, the HOA board continued business as usual, hosting meetings, issuing fines, and pretending nothing was wrong. Frustration mounted. If the legal system wouldn't act, if the authorities wouldn't step in, what was left? The protagonist wasn't about to roll over and accept defeat. If the system wouldn't deliver justice, then maybe justice would have to be served another way. Enter Ryan, the protagonist's cousin. A mechanical engineer with a penchant for creative problem-solving and a questionable moral compass, Ryan had been following the battle from afar with growing amusement. When the protagonist finally reached their breaking point, venting about the HOA's corruption over a few beers, Ryan leaned in with a wicked grin. "You know what they deserve," he said, drumming his fingers on the table. "A taste of their own medicine." The protagonist raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" Ryan pulled out his phone and showed a video, an industrial-grade expanding foam, the kind used in large-scale construction. Once sprayed, it hardened like concrete, sealing everything it touched. "Imagine this," Ryan continued. "We wait until their office is under renovation, right? No one around. We flood the place with this stuff. Every desk, every drawer, every smug little sign that says, HOA regulations enforced. When they come back, boom, solid rock." The idea was so ridiculous, so outrageously perfect, that the protagonist nearly choked on their drink. It was poetic justice. A symbol of everything the HOA had tried to bury, except this time they would be the ones dealing with an unmovable disaster. The plan came together faster than expected. The HOA office was undergoing a minor renovation, and the work crew conveniently left early on Fridays. That night, under cover of darkness, the protagonist and Ryan geared up. They dressed in work clothes, carried a few tools to look official, and casually strolled up to the office. No security cameras. No night patrols. Karen and her cronies had never imagined someone would strike back. Once inside, they worked fast. Ryan mixed the foam while the protagonist sprayed, filling cabinets, sealing doors, covering every inch of the pristine, self-important space. The final touch. A single, perfectly placed handprint in the middle of Karen's desk, like a signature on a masterpiece. By the time they were done, the entire office was an immovable tomb of hardened foam. Satisfied, they slipped away, disappearing into the night just as quietly as they had come. The message was clear: you buried us in sewage. Now let's see you dig yourselves out. The next morning, the protagonist didn't even have to check the HOA office to know the plan had worked. The news spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Karen Thompson had arrived early, ready to conduct business as usual, only to find the office entombed in solid foam. The first indication of her arrival had been a blood-curdling shriek, loud enough that even the early joggers had paused mid-stride. By the time the protagonist casually strolled over to see what was going on, Karen was in full meltdown mode. Her face was a shade of red that seemed physically impossible, her hands shaking as she jabbed at her phone, barking at some poor contractor to fix this immediately. But there was nothing to fix. The foam had hardened overnight, making the entire office completely unusable. The doors were sealed shut, the desks permanently encased, and the filing cabinets fused into unmovable blocks. Every record, every fine, every self-important policy document, gone, entombed in an indestructible monument to HOA corruption. The neighborhood gathered, watching the spectacle unfold with barely concealed amusement. Karen stormed up to the protagonist, her expression venomous. "I know you did this," she hissed. "You're going to pay for this." The protagonist simply crossed their arms. "Pay for what, Karen?" they said innocently. "A maintenance issue? Maybe you should file a complaint with the HOA." The barely contained laughter from the crowd only fueled Karen's rage, but there was nothing she could do. There were no witnesses, no security footage, and no way to prove anything. She was trapped, just like she had tried to trap the protagon. Karen had barely begun making frantic calls to her lawyers when the situation took an even worse turn for her. That afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up in front of her house, and out stepped Detective Aaron Fields, an investigator from the district attorney's office. He wasn't here about the foam. He wasn't even here about the sewage scandal. He was here for something much bigger. Over the past few weeks, the protagonist and their coalition of neighbors had been sending every shady email, fraudulent fine, and illegal financial transaction they uncovered to the authorities. And now, the DA's office was officially interested. Fields wasted no time. He marched straight up to Karen's house and knocked, his presence commanding enough that even Karen's usual bravado faltered. "Karen Thompson?" he asked, flashing his badge. "We need to have a conversation about some serious financial discrepancies in the HOA's records." Karen sputtered, her carefully curated facade crumbling. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. But Fields wasn't buying it. "We have evidence suggesting embezzlement, financial fraud, and environmental violations. If you'd prefer to discuss it downtown, we can arrange that." The entire neighborhood watched, relishing every second as Karen's reign of terror began to unravel. Within days, the investigation spread, and Karen's worst secrets came spilling out. The illegal sewage diversion, directly authorized by her to cut costs. The excessive fines, used to cover up missing HOA funds. The sudden foreclosures on certain properties. A coordinated scheme to drive homeowners out and sell their land to developers. And Karen hadn't acted alone. Howard Miller, the HOA treasurer, was soon implicated as well. By the end of the week, the news broke. Both Karen and Howard had been arrested for fraud, conspiracy, and environmental violations. The HOA board, once an untouchable force, was now crumbling from within. The city stepped in, launching a full-scale audit. Investigators pored over every document, every suspicious transaction, every shady deal. Homeowners who had been victimized for years finally got their chance to speak out. The power balance had shifted, and for the first time, the neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. With Karen and Howard gone, the HOA was effectively leaderless, and that meant one thing: new elections. The protagonist and their allies pushed hard for reform, rallying behind Jennifer Morales, a no-nonsense, wheelchair-using homeowner who had been one of Karen's frequent targets. Unlike the previous board, Jennifer was fair, level-headed, and actually cared about the community. When the votes were counted, it wasn't even close. Jennifer and her reform team swept the election, officially dismantling Karen's corrupt regime. The first order of business? Overturning every bogus fine, refunding stolen money, and reversing every unjust foreclosure. The second? Using HOA funds to clean up the protagonist's property, this time with legitimate contractors. And for the final cherry on top? The HOA board filed a lawsuit against Karen and Howard, seeking damages for their crimes. Justice was finally being served with the HOA's new leadership. The protagonist's nightmare finally ended. The sewage was cleaned up, their property restored, and the workshop rebuilt. The scars of the battle remained, but in the end, they had won. As they stood in their backyard, surveying their newly restored garden, a neighbor walked over with a small, unexpected gift, a fragment of hardened foam from the ruined HOA office. "Figured you'd want a souvenir," they said with a grin. The protagonist took it, running their fingers over the solid surface. It wasn't just a piece of foam, it was a symbol. A reminder that sometimes, when the system fails, a little creative justice is necessary.